Look at how this clever fellow built a kind of infernal machine to get back at his noisy neighbors, who never stopped bothering him from morning to night. A big carpenter's hammer, a board, and a servo motor, and there you have it. The machine, brilliantly improvised by this genius inventor, will do its job wonderfully, and as long as there is juice, it will not stop hammering the wall of the neighbors, making them taste a little of their own medicine. What a sweet revenge, isn't it? Well, if you want to see even more sweet revenge, watch the video until the end, because today we're going to show you the 20 funniest neighbor revenges you'll ever see on another channel. Fence fight. You've all known a neighbor who likes to snoop around and control everything in the neighborhood, even going so far as to report you to the authorities for disturbing the peace, when all you were doing was watching a good old spaghetti western on TV with the volume turned up a bit. Well, that's the kind of neighbors you're going to see on this funny sequence, which comes to us from Newton County, Georgia, USA. Donna Yop Paul is a brave local resident who just wanted a little privacy when she decided to raise her garden fence. She wanted to keep her little family sanctuary from prying eyes, especially since, like any self-respecting American, she loves to barbecue in her backyard. But it took the couple who live next door to her house to put their foot down and force Donna to shorten her fence. These neighbors, who are not, to put it mildly, busybodies, went so far as to invoke an old county law, which stipulates that fences must be the right size. Poor Donna, who had paid a small fortune to raise her fence, had to shorten it again, incurring additional costs she could have done without. But Donna had nevertheless reserved a nice surprise for her indiscreet neighbors, because while shortening her fence, she also thought of repainting it, using, however, not very conventional colors for a fence. And here is the result: a nice fence with a lot of colors, far from the standard gray that we expect to see in this kind of chic neighborhood. The Revenant even took a 20 years warranty on the paint, which means that her neighbors will be able to enjoy this colorful show for a long time to come. An angry millionaire. The Anglo-Saxons are really used to garden fence fights. It must even be a national sport in these parts. Go figure. On this funny sequence, which comes to us this time from Great Britain, you can see a man destroying the fence of his neighbor in a fit of mad rage. You certainly want to know which fly bit him, don't you? And why on earth is he attacking this poor wooden fence? Well, the man you see in these pictures trashing his neighbor's fence is Graham Wilden, an old Bentley millionaire who has built himself a gigantic personal leisure and recreation center in his own backyard. And it's fair to say that old Graham doesn't skimp on the means, since his personal center has a large 2-lane bowling alley, a 16-seat cinema, squash courts, a private casino, and even a bar. But this massive extension in his property has not really been to everyone's taste. Some of the neighbors, who were either angry or envious, you be the judge, decided to denounce him to the city authorities on the grounds that he did not have a building permit. The poor millionaire therefore had to battle with the law in order not to lose his precious leisure center so dearly acquired. This brings us back to these funny pictures where we see him taking his anger out on his neighbor's fence, the same ones that have been ruining his life and that have finally made him go out of his mind. Parking space. Private parking spaces are often the cause of quarrels between neighbors because some people think they can do whatever they want. These nuisances will not hesitate for a second to take your parking space, even if your name is clearly marked on it. Imagine you need a car because you have some errands to do or you want to go to work, and there you find that some moron is blocking your way with his car. Well, you have two solutions at that moment. Either you crash nicely like a coward, but make sure to put a note on the windshield of the offending vehicle, Or you do like this Australian mechanic and you arm yourself with a good old hydraulic jack and you give a hell of a lesson to this unscrupulous character. Irritated at the highest point by the insolent casualness of his neighbor who regularly stole his parking space, this brave mechanic decided to bring out the heavy artillery. He armed himself with a jack, with which he was able to literally lift his neighbor's vehicle. The excited mechanic then parked the car a little further away in a corner so cramped that it will be almost impossible to get it out of there without the help of a forklift. Dog excrement. Neighborhood quarrels often end with a handshake between responsible adults. And why not a good hot chocolate shared around a fireplace? That must be in another parallel dimension, because in our world, it doesn't usually happen like that, and the differences between neighbors are settled more by slaps and low blows than by mutual introspection and tolerance. On this sequence, which comes to us from the city of Detroit in the United States, a conflict of neighborhood degenerated in a completely unexpected way. And we warn you right away, it is not very pretty to see. Brenda Mullins is an inhabitant of the neighborhood to whom you should not really look for trouble, because this old vixen will not hesitate to drag you in the shittier in the mud if ever she has you in her sights. Her next-door neighbor recently suffered the consequences when her dog had the misfortune to go relieve itself in the garden of this old hack. Well, imagine that she did not hesitate 1 second to go to collect the excrements of the good doggy and to go to smear with the entrance door of her poor neighbor. I let you imagine the reaction of the unfortunate who, returning at home after a hard day of work, finds nose to nose with the feces of his own dog. Smart sweeper. Direction now to the Middle Kingdom, which shows so well that our Chinese friends have a lot of continuity in ideas, especially when it comes to educating the stupid. On these hilarious pictures, you can see an old municipal employee in charge of cleaning who just went crazy. The reason for his fit of nerves? A cheeky driver who parked his car in a place reserved for the disabled. The driver even pushed the insolence to the point of taunting the old sweeper, but he didn't take it well. Because it must be said that the old man has more than one trick up his sleeve, and his revenge, he was going to savor it as it should be. The good sweeper thus started to put garbage cans all around the parked car illegally, until surrounding it thus by all the sides. One can only imagine the face of this Sunday driver when he returns to his vehicle and finds it surrounded by dumpsters. Fireworks in Brazil. Some people don't hesitate to settle their neighborhood complex using heavy artillery, even with an aerial bombing. Maybe you don't believe me? Well, I'll let you discover this completely hallucinating sequence, and which comes to us directly from Brazil, a country where one knows so well how to take revenge. On these amazing images, you can see a drone loaded with fireworks, bombing a group of young people in the street. These young revelers were a little too noisy for their neighbor, who then found nothing better than to make them disperse by bombing them from the sky, thanks to his drone and a small reserve of fireworks. This air raid will surely remain in the annals of this district, and this band of young revelers will certainly not come back in the vicinity before a long time. No more night noise for this district, which finds finally the quietude, and all this thanks to our malignant small neighbor and his sacred drone bomber. An angry farmer. You know what they say about farmers, right? It is formally advised never to go trampling on their flower beds at the risk of suffering hellish reprisals. The sequence you are going to see now comes straight from Croatia, more precisely from Jakuševac, a district of the capital Zagreb. It must be said that this charming little suburban neighborhood was very calm and quiet not so long ago. But with the establishment of a giant flea market, Jakuševac has become a rather tumultuous place, with an almost daily concert of horns and cars that come and go in a thunderous noise of engines and exhaust pipes. But until now, the residents have not complained, and have accepted their fate without too much reluctance, showing the legendary stoicism of Croatians. But there had to be a drop, which will finally make the vase overflow. And this drop, ladies and gentlemen, is to take a private land for a free parking. That was the wrong thing to do, at least not to this old farmer. Because parking without authorization in his field is like going to war with him. So don't be surprised if he goes to the attic to get his old rifle. Because for these old men who knew the Second World War and who fought the Nazis, the land is sacred. Fortunately for these opportunistic motorists who had the nerve to park their vehicles on this field, this old farmer did not find his. So instead, he took his tractor and, as you can see on these hilarious pictures, he started to make deep furrows all around the cars. With these trenches dug in the mud, the cars won't move from there unless a tow truck is called. Their owners will have to pay a substantial fee to move their vehicles, much more than they would have paid for a parking space. A neighbor who registers the dog. Have you ever lived next door to someone who owns a dog? Well, you surely know what this poor unemployed Englishman had to endure and hero, in spite of himself, of this hilarious sequence. Andrew Nicklin is a brave 50-year-old man from the West Heath area of Birmingham, England, who spends most of his time at home since he was made redundant from his job. But while he can now enjoy his free time as he pleases, he still has a hard time concentrating when he is at home. His next-door neighbor has a dog that takes great pleasure in barking all day long without stopping, as if it were trying to disturb him constantly on purpose. Poor Andrew, who could not stand the loud and shrill barking, complained about it to his neighbor on several occasions. But it was in vain, because the latter turned a deaf ear to her neighbor's complaints and even insulted him when he raised his voice a little in front of her. You may think that Andrew crashed in front of his impertinent neighbor and that he had to resign himself to endure this canine din. But it's obvious that you don't know Andrew, because this old unemployed man had several strings to his bow, and the least we can say is that he enjoys his revenge like a pro. The bright idea that this brave man had was finally very simple: to make his neighbor taste a small sample of his own medicine. He then took a tape recorder with which he recorded these infernal barks. Then he played them on very powerful loudspeakers at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to tell you the face of the neighbor when she woke up with a start and all disheveled the terror in her soul, believing that the trumpets of the Last Judgment had sounded. And no need to describe to you her reaction when she finally understood that it was just her neighbor who had only reserved a dog for her. The pensioner puts up signs. What do you do when your neighbor's dog keeps defecating on your lawn? Well, a resident of a quiet neighborhood in Occo, Florida, who was tired of this kind of fecal unpleasantness, had a brilliant idea. Joe McElroy is a nice little retiree from the neighborhood who only wishes to water his roses and take care of his little garden, without having to find dog excrements on his nice lawn. But it must be said that this good man is not lucky, because his neighbors almost all have a dog, and they have the annoying habit of relieving themselves on his flower beds. Of course, he told them about his problem and complained to them several times, but it was like talking to a deaf person, because they did absolutely nothing to fix things. Joe was not defeated, however, and faced with his neighbor's lack of concern, he decided to take action. You want to know what this brave retiree did? Well, let's meet next week. I'm just kidding. I'll tell you right now what he did. This brave Joe has put cameras everywhere on his garden, but that's not all, because our nice little pensioner has also put up several warning signs with very funny messages. So his neighbors now know that he's not kidding anymore. And as if by a miracle, Joe doesn't find any more dog droppings on his garden. The neighbor with the chainsaw. We are now heading to the beautiful city of Geelong, Australia, the land of adventure and bushcraft, but also, it seems, of pretty neighborhood conflicts. On these amazing pictures, taken by a surveillance camera, you can see the exact moment when a man cuts the tree of his neighbor, after having introduced himself in his garden armed with a chainsaw. The tree probably had its branches sticking out of his side of the garden, which justified going to cut it down directly in his neighbor's garden. No one knows why he didn't just cut off the branch that was sticking out of his house, instead of cutting down the whole tree. But one thing is certain, this neighbor is a real piece of work. Because even when confronted with the images that showed him committing his little crime, he denied everything in a kind of psychotic delirium. He buys old cars. In the United States, the HOA for Homeowner Association are a kind of syndicate of co-ownership, but with much more extensive powers. These almost tyrannical associations generally have a myriad of laws and regulations that must be respected to the letter, and which are very often abused or completely absurd. You can literally get a warning letter just for leaving your garage door open, or if there is a broken paving stone in your driveway. Alan Nagel, a brave resident of the North Buffalo Drive neighborhood, is also regularly harassed with letters from his trustee. He is reproached for having rust on his gate or weeds in his garden because it would harm the harmony and beauty of the neighborhood. The poor man, who couldn't stand being bothered almost every day, finally decided it was time to do something about it. His brilliant plan consisted in buying some particularly hideous old cars and to come and park them right in front of his house, an absolutely fabulous nose-thumbing to his noisy neighbors, who now have to put up with the horrible sight of these old piles of junk in their so beautiful neighborhood. Fence war. Here is now a scene of a quarrel between neighbors, which will certainly remain in the annals of YouTube and which proves to us that sometimes adults are worse than children. This scene from America shows us conflict between neighbors which broke out because of a misplaced fence. This little crank, who is ranting like the devil, had a nervous breakdown when he realized that his neighbor's fence was encroaching on his property. On these images, for the least entertaining, you can see him squaring in all directions, in the grip of an almost uncontrollable rage, and which denotes formidably with the Olympian calm of his neighbor. The latter remains unmoved by this madman, preferring to call the police rather than fight with him. Broom fight. Do you like Star Wars-style lightsaber battles? Good thing, because that's exactly what we're going to see in this hilarious sequence. Well, it's not really about lightsabers, but rather brooms. It's true that it's a little less brilliant said like that, but believe me, the show is just as enjoyable. This amazing fight was filmed by one of the neighbors, and as you can see, the two protagonists are determined to fight. Armed with a spray paint, this young lady is going to challenge her next-door neighbor armed with a broom. The young Sheena, the warrior, will then hurry to her apartment to arm herself, this time with a good old mop. And here is that the most dreamlike fight of all time takes place, right before your eyes wide open with amazement and fascination. Note, by the way, the incredible kata she does with her broom, and which is worthy of a samurai warrior. The morning routine. How do you shoot a documentary about chimpanzees in the middle of the city? Well, just go and live in the neighborhood of this poor Australian family, who have to put up with a neighbor who is probably from the planet of the apes. Look at the little game she plays with them every day when they wake up. A kind of simian morning ritual, and which would easily find its place in a primate community. As you can see on these almost surreal images, this young hysterical lady tries by all means to provoke her neighbors, who, far from being scared by these antiques, are rather completely hilarious in front of the show that is played in front of them. It must be said that in Australia, we can find all kinds of endemic wild animals, and one thing is certain, this young scatterbrain is one of the rarest specimens. The Call of the Crows. It often happens in disputes between neighbors that we call each other a few bird names in the process. But in the hilarious sequence that you are going to see now, it is literally a question of birds of ill omen, crows in fact. Yes, this is the million-dollar idea of this young Englishman from Oxford to get back at his neighbor with whom he is constantly at war. A war where all the means are good to make the life of the other completely unbearable. Well, this 37-year-old man decided to call all the crows in the region using a special bird whistle. In the blink of an eye, hundreds of crows flee in from the four corners of the sky, and guess which roof they landed on? Bingo! You were right, because these birds of misfortune flew directly to the house of the poor neighbor who thought he was reliving a scene from Alfred Hitchcock's cult movie. Needless to say, the crows feasted in the poor man's garden, stealing all the best fruits of his orchard. Garbage can conflict. Neighbors can agree on anything, except when it comes to the location of dumpsters. It's true that no one likes to park their car right next to the garbage cans, if only for fear of hitting them while parking, not to mention the foul odors that emanate from this veritable nest of microbes. On this hilarious sequence, you will witness a quarrel between neighbors that degenerates a bit and ends up in a festival of garbage. Well, it's true that the images seem to come from a parallel universe. So much they are surreal, but I assure you, it is indeed on the planet Earth that this brawl between interposed dumpsters takes place. Retaining wall. And we return for this sequence in Australia, where we saw that the quarrels of neighbors are almost a national sport. It is thus in the district of Adamsur Park, the western suburbs of Sydney, that we find ourselves in order to attend in the first place this conflict of neighborhood for the least hilarious. This couple of old Chinese pensioners is in disagreement with their neighbors as for the construction of a small retaining wall by the latter. But it must be said that for these old people from the Middle Kingdom, this wall that they believe to be beyond their property is like the Great Wall of China, and they have sworn to demolish it brick by brick. Infernal Machine 2. Here is another infernal machine specially formulated to make life unbearable for its upstairs neighbors. Thanks to this ingenious system, this little genius was finally able to take sweet revenge on the neighbors who live on the floor above him and who have been bugging him since they moved into the building. The improvised machine is doing its job very well, because the last time I checked, the neighbors have moved to a building a little quieter, which is a shame for chronic night owls. Finger of Honor. And to finish on a dark note of humor, here's the very special Christmas gift that a young American woman from Louisiana offered to her neighbor, with whom she had a fight not so long ago. So, to wish her a Merry Christmas in her own way, she decided to install a huge luminous middle finger on the roof of her house, offering her dear neighbor a decoration she could have done without.